there. So let me continue talking about Duverger's law as I was. So Duverger's law, as I mentioned, is just that a single member district system encourages a two-party system to exist for the simple fact that instead of running one race where there are two parties and then other parties competing, you're running multiple races, dozens or hundreds of that same race, all those hundreds of times. And in all of those cases, whoever wins the most in each locality is going to be the winner. So whoever the losing parties are get nothing in all those localities. Whereas if you spread it out nationwide and a 5% or 15% showing by a minor party gets you 5 or 15% of the seats in a legislature, then that's called proportional representation. And that is a system that does not encourage a two-party system, because after 2 or 3 elections, even if you start out with 2 pretty dominant political parties, you're going to start to get really more competitive looking landscapes for minor parties. They're going to start to sometimes eclipse those 2 major parties. So that's why it's a multi-party system that's encouraged by a proportional representation system. And so that's what they have in countries like Germany, Israel, a couple of others. I believe Italy has some form of it as well. But a single member district system is rare in the modern kind of context. The only other major country that really has it, I would say, is Great Britain. And that's who we modeled our system from, interestingly enough. And the other kind of major kind of voting method that I want to talk to you about is runoff voting and instant runoff voting. So a runoff is, as I have mentioned, that is what they're doing in Georgia right now, because in the U.S. Senate races that went along with the presidential race this past election, no candidate won more than 50% of the vote. And so in Georgia and I believe Louisiana, I'm not sure if there are other states that obey this idea, this law, this runoff law. But if no candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, then there has to be a runoff between the top 2 candidates, and whoever gets 50% in that election gets to win the race. So they sort of treat Election Day like a primary, so that the top vote getters are the ones who get to advance. California does the same thing in our system because it doesn't include parties, which is why in both the 2018 and I believe 2016 U.S. Senate elections, it featured a candidate from Southern California and a candidate from Northern California, and both were Democrats. So we have a similar system, except it's resolved by Election Day. So primary day is not party primary day. It's just whoever going to be the top vote getters in that election, who's going to advance to Election Day. And so if there are only 2 candidates on Election Day, one of them will definitely get more than 50%. So that's what a runoff is, and so we have them, except they happen on Election Day, and Georgia and Louisiana have them usually about a month after, sometimes 2 months after Election Day. So the one in Georgia, just to be timely about it, happens on January 5th, and it's very dramatic because there are 2 Senate seats in Georgia, and whoever wins gets to control the U.S. Senate. So there are 2 seats, and right now it's divided 50 to 48 in favor of the Republicans. And if the Democrats win both of these seats, they are going to win control of the U.S. Senate, because they'll have 50 votes, and then they'll be able to have a tie-breaking vote with Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. So that will be a very interesting situation where the Democrats would hold all 3 majorities in all 3 of the kind of lawmaking chambers, both the House and the Senate, makes up Congress, as well as the presidency, of course. So they'd be able to avoid what's called divided government. And so, and let me come back to divided government in a second. So one more way that you can avoid, that you can generate a majority for a candidate, aside from the Electoral College creating one by kind of manufacturing one, would be to have a runoff for the presidential election. So if we were to have a system that was not a single member district system and not an electoral college system, because an electoral college system is basically the same thing as a single member district system, where you have the same, as I mentioned, where I cited Ross Perot, almost getting 3 electoral college votes out of 538, even though he had at one point 40% of the vote, but on election day only 20. So if we were able to abolish the electoral college, sounds very democratic, small d democratic. It sounds very sounds sort of ideal for a modern democracy. However, what we would really create is a new issue, which is that we are enabling the idea that whoever wins a plurality, meaning the most votes and not most of the votes, to win the election. So in other words, if the top vote getter only received 39% of the vote, or even 29% of the vote, or if there are a lot of candidates, it's conceivable that only 5% of the vote, but then you'd probably have a much stickier situation. But it's very possible you could get somebody in the low 40s winning the presidency, as they have in the Electoral College. But it would necessitate that you kind of suspend the mandate idea from a president, that a president is elected to fulfill promises that a majority somehow elected him or her to carry out. So anyway, there's no easy answer to this, but I would say that we could see our crystal ball future by looking at somewhere like France, that actually does have a couple of major parties, although they're waning now. But throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way to today, they've had 2 major parties, the socialists and the kind of Republican rally party on the right. And if they would have a primary, and then they would choose a candidate, and then they would have an election, and then if no candidate won, they would have a runoff. And the runoff has happened usually, more often than not. So or at least as often as not. So the point being that essentially they have a 3-round rather than just a 2-round presidential election. And it seems like Americans are pretty vote weary at this point. So, the answer, it certainly wouldn't be less politics, it would be more politics. So if we were to abolish the Electoral College, that is, maybe that's more democratic, but given the kind of lack of attention that people already have to most elections in the U.S., I would say that probably is a losing proposition, but what do I know? Because you want to avoid divided government, and when you have a 2-party system like we have here among Democrats and Republicans, it's never easy to negotiate priorities at the national level when you have different houses representing different parties. And the negotiations can get tricky, and they can get very, again, dramatic, to the point where the government gets shut down, which it has a handful of times since the 1990s. That never really used to happen or be an option, but as polarization has increased and the parties have become more irreconcilable between them, and some of these, the Republicans have gotten more conservative and the Democrats have gotten a little more liberal, or at least they've gotten more sure about their policy positions that are not Republican Party positions, um, they have um, they have kind of played um, a game of chicken to see who is going to blink first. And in the 1990s, um, the budget compromise ended up having to be a post government shutdown um, compromise. And so that has been, the last resort is to shut down the government when there's not a continuing agreement to even a stopgap funding measure when they can't agree on how the government's going to be funded that year at all. So they can't even agree on just continuing to have last year's be the law for a little while longer. So that's what divided government brings about, is kind of a stalemate. Because if you have for example, a Democratic president, a Republican Senate, and a Democratic House, then who gets to prevail in the negotiations? Who gets to have their priorities, their voters satisfied? And the answer usually is both parties agree to things that a lot of their bases don't like, but that's the ideal at least. But in actuality, somebody wins, and I can tell you that there haven't been really that many major liberal policy initiatives that have won out in these types of negotiations in the last couple of decades. So the Republicans, although they've sort of haven't been able to muster a popular majority for most of the last 20 years among voters, they seem to have really been able to run the table with negotiations those last 20 years. And it looks like with the Biden administration, if the Democrats don't end up winning in Georgia, which is, as likely as not, it's really very divided down there. It's 50-50. So it's anybody's guess and anybody's win. But if the Democrats don't win, then either one of the two seats, then the Republicans will essentially have a veto over Democratic policy priorities, including like any kind of coronavirus relief packages or defense policy or really anything, taxes, healthcare, all of it. And not to mention, any sort of judicial nominations that the Biden administration would like to push through that's going to meet a great big halt sign or stop sign in the Senate. So anyway, that's why they like to avoid divided government. In the past, it's been a Republican president and Democratic House, and it's been every kind of variation you can think of, a Democratic president in a Republican House and a Democratic Senate. One thing to note is that there hasn't been a Democrat elected in his first term without Democratic majorities in both houses since the 1880s. So you sort of, and usually what happens is the first 2 years, there's at least the last couple of generations, there's a Democratic House and Senate the first 2 years of an administration, and then there's a new congressional election, and then the Republicans end up beating them because Republicans have a really, really important advantage in congressional elections, which is that Americans don't vote very much in midterm elections, or they vote a lot less. So they usually have about a 20-point dip. So if the election in 1 year during a presidential election, say, has about 60% voter participation, 2 years later, there's elections for most governors in the U.S., as well as all of the House, all 435 seats, and 1/3 of the Senate. And in that, what's called the midterm elections, only about 40% of people will vote. And and who do you think that 40% is going to be? It's going to be people who are called super voters, or people who are called, people who are called super voters. And usually super voters are those people who are most engaged with politics, most incentivized to be involved with politics, and most experienced with politics. So that means, you guessed it, older, wealthier Republican voters have a much higher turnout rate in midterm elections than Democratic voters do. And more conservative Democrats turn out more so than more kind of left-wing Democrats do during midterm elections as well. So you're going to have a very distinct advantage for Republicans. So we kind of get to skip to the midterm of the Biden presidency, so we probably won't get to see very many liberal initiatives coming out of his administration. But that's just a guess. That's just me looking at history and seeing kind of what the most likely outcome is. I could certainly be wrong. Let's see, who votes, voting methods. And finally, just to mention that there's this idea about voter fraud that a lot of people have asked me about in class, actually, and fraud. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's really. But I'll make sure I link to a story that should just about let you know just how rare voter fraud really is. And how serious it can be. It can and maybe should be taken, but maybe not. and there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. And I guess the word fraud can mean different things to different people, but I think it's at least legally, it's a very clear standard. So and that clear standard has never been met on a widespread scale in American democracy in the modern era. So, President Trump, it's fair to say, has been grasping at a lot of straws to try to win support to be able to stay in office. And I think that seems to be waning, at least as of this recording, right before November 20th. So I don't think that that's going to go anywhere, but he was alleging that there was voter fraud before there even was voter fraud, all the way through this year during the election campaign. So, he fired his cybersecurity official who had come out last week and said that this was the most safe and secure election in the history of the United States. And so Trump fired him for speaking out in that way. So anyway, so fraud is not very widespread. However, the claim that fraud is widespread, it must be said, comes primarily from Republican state legislatures. And Republican state legislatures have been passing for about the last 15 or 20 years these voter ID laws in order to curb voter fraud. So, where did this idea come from? It came from ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is essentially a shadow lobbying group funded by the oil and gas conglomerate known as Koch Industries. And what they would do is they would kind of masquerade as a charity, but then kind of invite state legislators to bipartisan state legislators, of course, but mostly Republicans, to kind of getaways where they would kind of wine and dine them to the point where they would say, well, we have these bills that we hope that you can introduce, and we'll continue to support you and take you on these junkets. So that's part of the story. There's a documentary that I may or may not be able to find for you, but that's sort of interesting. But it's kind of an old story of just lobbyists writing bills and saying, here's a bill, so go ahead and pass that, and we'll continue to support you. And so rather than just informing them really what to prioritize, literally lobbyists, which are just salespeople for corporations and sometimes public interest groups, mostly corporations, are just writing bills and saying fill in the blank or your name here and go sponsor this. And the voter ID law is one of these laws. And the idea is that because the harder you make it to vote, essentially the fewer Democrats vote or the fewer Democratic voters vote. So in 2012, just to show you some clear evidence of this, there was a public speech made by a very public state legislator in Pennsylvania named Mike Turzai, who said, he was kind of at a Republican event, but it was a public event. Media was there, and he said that we just passed the voter ID. He was the state Senate Majority Leader, so the Republican leader in the state Senate, and he said, we just passed the voter ID law, which is going to allow Mitt Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania, to applause. So it was kind of this unspoken thing, and the reason that it's so notable is because it's so rare that that's talked about as a motivation, but it so clearly is the motivation to pass all of these laws. That I think in something like 20 or 30 states, voter ID laws have been passed, and not in California. And you're supposed to just go and vote, and you register to vote and write your signature. And most of the time, that's what the law says, is that you just have to match your signature. You don't have to bring your new ID with you. And the reason that's significant, rather than just notable at the individual level, is because most people who don't have a driver's license, or alternatively a government-issued photo ID that states that you can't drive, are senior citizens and immigrants, as well as whether legal or whether naturalized citizens or not. So, but only citizens can vote. So that's neither here nor there. But African Americans are the other population that have a lower percentage of driver's licenses, which I'm not sure what the source of that disparity is, but it just ends up being statistically true. So those are two constituencies that when they vote for Democrats, they tend to, or when they turn out, they tend to turn out for Democrats. So, it would be like Democrats trying to get people who are, say, not Christian, or who don't own a business, or who are uber wealthy. So, not saying that they don't want Republicans to vote, they just don't want those people who happen to support Republicans to vote. So it's the same idea. So that's why the voter ID laws kind of matter, and they've done their job ostensibly, and in many states that voter ID laws have I'm sure contributed to kind of a lower turnout in some states where it's been adopted. And one other thing to mention is that California did recently pass a law that restored voting rights to people who had carried out their sentences, who had been convicted of a felony and served their sentences. But anyway, many states disenfranchise those folks for life, and this again disproportionately impacts African Americans. So I'm gonna have a reminder to put in that link as well. So that kind of does it for the kind of standard voter ID and voting and polarization lecture that you need. But I want to take a few minutes and kind of break down in very broad strokes this kind of chart I've drawn to my left, that you have a much more detailed one to look at in your book. But before I do that, I'm just going to make sure that the camera is still filming. Hang on a second. Okay, it is. Let me take a sip of my tea and talk about the political parties in America. So, very quickly, just to tell you, it's not as if have always been political parties since the beginning of time. But in our kind of modern system of government, that really is how people are represented in legislatures and in government, is through political parties. They didn't really want them in the beginning of the U.S., but it seemed like they were really swimming against the tide. There was already different forces that were kind of different kind of orientations toward the way the U.S. should behave within the Continental Congress, whether that was between the North and the South, or between kind of larger states and smaller states, but seemed like they were inevitable. So despite that, they tried to enact a constitution that tried to dissuade political parties from existing, but Madison, when he kind of was trying to sell the idea of this new constitution to voters, did end up saying that no, what this constitution really does is it harnesses this tendency of people to engage in political factions. And those factions can take the form of parties, but he didn't mean that they should necessarily always coalesce in that particular organizational way. So two political parties emerged when the Constitution was adopted. The Federalists, that were really led by Alexander Hamilton, this lawyer, very young lawyer from New York, as well as George Washington and John Adams from Boston. George Washington of Virginia, I should say, and John Adams of Boston, Massachusetts, a lawyer. And the Jeffersonian Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson, who was, at the time the Constitution was written, an ambassador in Paris. So he was not the writer at all of the Constitution. He had written the Declaration of Independence 12 years before. So since then, he was the first ambassador of the U.S. to Paris at the time that the French had their very first revolution. So he just always seems to be in very exciting places. Jefferson does, but one of those exciting places is not the writing of the Constitution. But one of the two main political parties ends up being the Republican Party, and he ends up really acting as their leader and the kind of leader of the opposition. He's appointed as the first Secretary of State, and that really is the ambassador to the world. As the foreign minister is what it's called in many, in most really other nations. And he's in Washington's cabinet, kind of a national unity cabinet, and he ends up resigning after a few years. Takes a while, but then he runs against John Adams, the Federalist president, first vice president and then president, and they have a couple of really harsh campaigns against each other, but then just as a note of history, they end up dying on the same day, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So they both died on July 4th, 1826. Isn't that weird? And I think Jefferson's last words were something like, or Adams' last words were, "Jefferson still lives," but Jefferson had died a few hours before. They didn't have cell phones at that time. Anyway, so they ended up being friends again later in life, happy ending and all that. But Jefferson represented, he kind of preached quite a bit about the end of slavery. And we all know the kind of irony is that he not only had practiced this horrible human rights abuse in his own kind of agrarian plantation, but he also seemed to have a mistress, or whatever you'd like to call her. Sally Hemings was essentially what we'd call his second wife, and she had many children of whom he was the father, and so there's a whole history of that as well, the kind of descendants of the kind of Hemingses and the Jeffersons. But Jefferson was a hypocrite, certainly, but it's often said that you have to look at what was going on at the time. Slavery was booming and was a normal practice. but it shouldn't be normalized, of course. It's just hard to take any of his kind of writing seriously because he so preaches against slavery, but makes almost no note of the fact that he practices enslavement of other human beings himself. So at any rate, a lot of people followed him because he tried to be very much the common man. He would there's a very common callback to the way that he administered the government is that he would answer the front door himself in his kind of informal clothes when he was the president in the White House, which is very different from the way John Adams and George Washington had conducted it, which is to say that they acted more like traditional monarchs, really, than kind of more common man oriented presidents. But Jefferson's support did come mostly from the South, and it was more of an agrarian society, and manufacturing was just starting to grow in the North, and that's really where most of the support for the Federalists came from. And so, I don't want to really belabor this too long, but just to say that sometimes we like to say that political scientists like to say that there are realignments every generation or so. I read a book called Electoral Realignments done by David Mayhew that really debunks this whole idea that there's anything scientific at all about realignments and one election doesn't necessarily determine the next election. And I just prefer to think of them as kind of general time periods that are more or less generational. But nevertheless, it's still helpful to kind of see the lineage of these two parties organizationally. So really, this was the South, the first, and people who not only practiced slavery but also benefited from it were mostly in the South, and for the most part supported the Democrats all through this time. The Jeffersonians really evolved into the Democratic Party, the Jacksonian Democratic Party. But at one point, the Federalists, were really abolished as a force because they opposed the War of 1812, and it got to the point where they threatened to secede from the Union, and this is in 1815, 1812, 1813, 1814, and it was only just talk, but it was unpopular enough that they never won another national election. And so they faded from history, and then there was a period where everyone belonged to really this party, the Jeffersonian Republican Party, but it again kind of split into two factions, the National Republicans and the Democratic Republicans, and so the Democratic Republicans became the Democratic Party, and the National Republicans took the name of the Whig Party because that was an old English name for the party that opposed the tyranny of a king. And they were talking about Andrew Jackson being a tyrant, and in many ways they were right. But in many ways they were really serving the more kind of wealthier interests of the nation as well. And they were somewhat hypocritical because they still endorsed or at least agreed not to talk about slavery because it benefited manufacturing interests in the North and the ability to buy cheap cotton and other raw materials because there were no labor costs. So the Northern Republicans were a kind of rebuke of this. Republicans were founded as a party in the 1850s from mostly Northern Whigs, but some Northern Democrats as well, and some people who had already broken away for this so-called Free Soil Party. And they were an anti-slavery party. They didn't want slavery to expand to the new territories in the West, and they were really against this idea of banning talking about slavery, so that slavery would just continue. But they didn't favor, or at least didn't talk much about openly, the idea of abolishing slavery in the South and where it already existed. But that's how the South took it. When Lincoln won with about 40% of the vote, but he still won the majority of the Electoral College nationwide. But there were some states where he got no votes. And those were southern states. So when Lincoln won, it kind of provoked this kind of rebellion in the South, and the Southern legislatures or conventions got together and voted and said, we're going to leave the Union because we're afraid that this party is going to abolish, is just going to threaten our entire economy. Not to mention our gross mistreatment of again, fellow human beings. But we all know how that story ended. And then in Reconstruction, Republicans really got their way, and Northern manufacturing interests got their way, especially during Reconstruction. They were able to kind of treat the South as a conquered territory, and really, whatever you think of the South and slavery, and you shouldn't think anything good of it at all. What happened in the South, in many ways, was very cruel to everyone in the economy. They were, there was. Yes, they empowered newly freed voters to be able to vote and participate in the political process. But aside from that, the North ran it as a conquered colony, and they were able to exploit, prison labor and all sorts of other human rights abuses and confiscated territory left and right, and so to the point where people's money was worthless. And so anyway, it's a pretty dark period in American history from almost every perspective, is Reconstruction, and post-Reconstruction, of course. And then, you have this ongoing hostility between North and South, culturally and politically, for the next couple of generations. And that manifests itself in the Ku Klux Klan, of course, this terrorist organization, but also in the suppression of the right to vote of newly freed people. And so even with that, the South remains kind of this kind of bastion of the Democratic Party up until about the 1930s, when Republicans were increasingly kind of a free enterprise oriented party, and they had been pro-business before, but they really started to oppose spending at the national level. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but just if you want to know really when the South became Republican as opposed to Democratic, I believe I've covered it before in the Civil Rights lecture, but just to say as a clear break, in 1964, which would be like, right here, the Democratic Party passes, in the wake of John F. Kennedy's assassination, they are able to muster enough support to win passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which banned the banning of anyone from places of public accommodation, and also banned federal funding from being distributed to anyone or any agency that discriminated on the basis of race or national origin. So at that point, and since that point at least, there's been a sharp turn away by Southern African Americans as well as national African Americans towards the Republican Party, away from the Republican Party. And so, but it really started before that in the 1930s, when poor folks and not only poor folks but many African Americans were the beneficiaries of New Deal programs, and so they began to vote Democratic, and this progresses through the Civil Rights Movement, and really all the way towards the 1980s is when you start to see the real break that Southern whites, for the most part, are voting Republican now for the first time, and Democrats continue their march really leftward in rhetoric and in kind of matters of social welfare and civil rights, for racial minorities, not to mention for women. So yeah, this is organizationally, this is when the South was democratic, was kind of in all these years up until then, and really up and we'll dip into this era too. But it's not really until the 1930s when you start to see a really solidified Northern Democratic Party becoming the majority in the North, and contending with the Republicans at a national level in a way they hadn't been able to at all. Since the Republican Party had been formed. So the New Deal really stopped the national dominance of the Republican Party, which had been going on for about 70 years. But that was, perhaps for good reason, since the Great Depression could almost entirely be laid at that party's feet. Okay, let me take a look. Good. Okay. So we've come to the end of this this particular lecture and this particular kind of class. So I will just say that I've enjoyed getting to know all of you, even though it's been a very strange and in some ways terrible time. But I appreciate this opportunity to just kind of as much as I can impart what I understand about American politics and government to you. And I hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't enjoyed it, I'm sorry, but I've tried to make it worth your time, and I've tried to give as much attention as I could to it. And I've had a lot of support at home to do that, so I need to thank my partner. She's been really invaluable in getting all of this set up. I also just want to, thank Sac State for being really flexible as far as how this kind of course delivery is going to happen, and the kind of support that's been given for the transition to online learning in this environment. And we're going to be online again next semester. And so, it's going to be hopefully a little more polished next time around. But, that's always the hope, and that's what I'm trying to do. So if you have particular feedback for me, I encourage you to write me an email. But if you really enjoyed this course, please do, drop me a line at ratemyprofessor.com. I'll provide a link to that on Canvas as well. And yeah, I hope that you all do stay in touch. If you have something that you want to ask me about in the future, my email address and phone number. It's going to stay the same, and so kind of how to find me. And yeah, it's been really interesting this semester. And after you watch this, we're still going to meet a few times over Zoom. And we're still going to have a final essay. So if any of these topics are interesting to you, I encourage you to start reading about them now. And that way, by the time we get to the final essay period, you'll be able to really write something you can be proud of. Okay. So again, thank you for kind of tolerating this transition, and I so applaud your willingness as a student to work through this time period and kind of tough it out in this environment that you did not clearly sign up for as a student. You wanted to be in person, and you got this online experience instead. I hope that this course has at least been one step in a direction towards the kind of experience you expected to get in an in-person, or maybe should have been able to expect in an in-person environment in a kind of rapidly changing digital world anyway. Okay, so I guess that's all I have, and just to note that it is 9:45 on November 19th, and so there will be no more YouTube videos recorded between now and the end of the semester. but the last day that you'll be turning anything in is December 18th, and that's going to be when your final essay is due. So I hope you've had a nice holiday, and when you're watching this, and we're going to now be in the home stretch together, live and in person, not in person but live, on Zoom and over email and phone and everything else, of course. All right, with that, thanks for watching.